Hey everybody, this is going to be the 5th presidential live stream. Just want to make sure everything's working like it's supposed to. Hopefully you can hear me well. Excuse me. Really excited to go over James Monroe as I was getting ready to do the presidential talks. Let me move this out of the way. It appears to be working like it's supposed to. Okay. As I was getting ready to do all the presidential stuff, I was not sure a lot of the presidential orders. I know you have to kind of do it in school, and I think at one point I knew it, maybe, I don't know, 6th grade, 7th grade, something like that, U.S. history. But learning so much more about the presidents and what was going on here, the in depth. I mean, I've got pages upon pages of notes here because there's just so much that's going on. So much I didn't even realize that I'm really excited to share with you. So James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States. He was considered the last founding father. Cool thing about being the last founding father is that he was the last founding father to have served in the Revolutionary War. He was a young man, worked very hard to be bipartisan. I didn't mention this yet. He was president for 2 terms from 1817 to 1825. He disliked slavery, but during his presidency, it actually became a bigger and more entrenched institution than it had been before, which is crazy because he so wanted it to end. He fought against, he was a big proponent to ending buying slaves. He considered anybody that brought slaves from Africa to the U.S. Pirates, and he aggressively attacked them. But with the Missouri Compromise and Missouri and Maine coming into the Union, the big fights that started there, kind of the prerequisite for the state-to-state battles that were going on with slavery. As much as he wanted slavery to end, he during his presidency, it actually got worse. So he was a famous war hero in the Revolutionary War and successful as the interim Secretary of War in the War of 1812. At that time, he actually is the only president to have ever been the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War at the same time. Crazy circumstances there where the Secretary of War resigned, and Madison didn't think he could make him the Secretary of War, and Congress was like, look, just put him in there for now. We need somebody. I mean, we're in the middle of a war. Washington, D.C. just got burned down. He did a lot of stuff for, he was great as Secretary of War. He did a very good job. He was born, I'm going to unplug that. I kind of had it going so I could hear what was going on, but every time Discord messages come through, it sends me a notification that's like a bloop bloop sound. That's what that is. So I unplugged that. He was born April 28th, 1758, and died July 4th, 1831. His presidency was called the Era of Good Feelings. He served as a delegate to the Congress of the Confederation for Virginia from 1783 to 1786. He was a United States Senator in the First Continental Congress, or after the First Continental Congress, from 1790 to 1794. Then he became a minister to France during the I was going to say George Washington presidency. He went over there and he did well. But because of the Jay Treaty, relations with France fell apart, right after during the time he was there, and then right after he was there. He pretty much felt like he got no support from Washington, and it really soured their relationship. And then he went back to France to negotiate the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase. So because he was a Jefferson acolyte, Jefferson knew how well he had done when he was over there, even under bad circumstances, because Jefferson was the Secretary of State, and Monroe reported directly to Jefferson. So it was his baby, really. let's see, read my own notes here. And then he was minister to Great Britain after that from 1803 to 1807. Really bad for him and his wife's health. But he got to know a lot of the people in the UK, kind of created relationships there. They had good and sour relationships. One political house liked America and wanted to deal with America, and the other political house was like, look, there are offshore bad kids that we don't want to talk to anymore. And so as he first got there, they were very hostile to him. Then the other party came in, they took over. Things started rolling, things started happening, and then he died. His second in command came in. They were still trying to get things done for about 2-3 years, and then they got voted out of power, and the other party got voted back in, and all that fell apart. And that's why we got the War of 1812. Let's see, where was I at? He was governor of Virginia for 3 terms, but the governorship of Virginia was very hamstringed by the Virginia state legislature at the time. You could only do 3 terms, and they were 1-year re-electing terms each time. So he only served 3 years as governor, but he was elected in 3 times as the governor, 3 different years. Kind of, we think about that now. We go, they're 4-year terms. He didn't even serve a full 4-year term, but he served 3 terms. He was voted in 3 times, which kind of speaks to he did well, through his whole set of terms, I guess, if that makes sense. And then he was Secretary of State and Secretary of War during Madison's presidency, Secretary of State for all of his presidency from 1811 to 1817, and then Secretary of War just for the second half of the War of 1812. And then he became president right after Madison. He was president for 2 terms from 1817 to 1825. His vice president was Daniel D. Tompkins. Let me pull up this here. He ran against, I had it written down here. Who do you run against? Courtwright, I believe, is the guy he beat out for president. Rufus King. I'm sorry, I was completely wrong. It's Rufus King. So he beat Rufus King as president in the 1816 presidential election. His Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams, who then succeeded him as president, and they together wrote the Monroe Doctrine, which is probably the thing he's most remembered for, and it carries his name. He became an abolitionist in his late years, joining the American Colonization Society, which was actually founded during his presidency. Notable members: James Madison, the president before him, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, and many, many others. And their idea was to create a slave colony in Africa, Liberia, for liberating. And then because of his efforts to create Liberia, they named the capital of Liberia after him. And it is Monrovia. He is on a $1 coin issued in 2008 with the Statue of Liberty on the back. I've got it right here. Can you see that? They made these for a few years. They did a bunch of it's not coming in clear, but I've got John Adams, James Madison, James Monroe, William Henry Harrison. I started looking for these when I realized they actually had come out, and then they stopped printing them in 2012, so we never got our modern day presidents like Obama. I think they made it through the first 20 presidents, and then they stopped making them. If you ride MARTA here in Atlanta, whenever they give you change, they give you $1 coins. This is Buchanan. And so I had a 20 and I needed to get $1 back. And I started researching Madison, and I started looking at these $1 coins, and didn't realize I had a James Madison coin in my pocket, and thought, because I was like, oh, I need to try to find one for the live stream. And I already had one in my pocket because I'd gotten change from MARTA, which is Atlanta's public transportation. Kind of like New York subway, but not as good, not even close to being as good. But when I go to DragonCon, it does save me money on parking. So all right, so we are flipping over to the early years of his life, and guess what? I have a banner for that. All right, so if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I would love to hear your questions. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me. So he was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, to Spence Monroe and Elizabeth Jones. They had 5 children together: Elizabeth, James, Spence, Andrew, and Joseph. Westmoreland County is also the county that George Washington was born in, James Madison was born in, and James Monroe. So the 3 of them were all born in the same county, but they never, all of them moved away from Westmoreland County to much fertile counties like Kings County and the county that Madison ended up living in. Albemarle County is where he ended up living most of his life. They were children of a Scottish lineage and proud of it, and it was spelled Monroe very differently. The Scottish version of Monroe, I didn't write that down, but I do remember seeing that it was spelled differently when they first came over to the United States from Scotland. His mother is Elizabeth, was the daughter of James Jones, who was a congressman, judge. He did a bunch of stuff, and he became a huge factor in James' life after his parents died. At 11, he was enrolled in a school, but only went to school for 11 weeks because he was needed on the farm for planting and harvesting. James Monroe's mother died in 1772, and his father also died in 1774. So at 16, he was an orphan, and he was taking care of all his siblings. That's when his grandfather, Jones, came in and basically like wrapped the family. He didn't have any. No, it was his uncle, Jones, came in and basically adopted all the children, sent James to school at William and Mary College in Williamsburg, introduced him to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, many of the prominent men of the age, John Henry, and so kind of really got him started in politics, got him to get to know some people, and his connection to William and Mary got him to know some people, all of that because of his uncle semi-adopting him at 16. And then after a year of college, at 17, the war broke out, and he joined a group of people that stormed the governor's palace, kicked the governor out. The governor actually went onto the prison ship out in the, the something sound out there, and joined the war effort. So as we jump into the war, let's go to the war. Monroe dropped out of college to join the 3rd Virginia Regiment. He then arrived in New York just in time to retreat and join the very perilous and lucky that the war didn't end as they tried to retreat out of New York. If you know anything about the war, as they retreated out of New York, they went across New Jersey, across the Delaware River, and then on Christmas Eve they crossed the Delaware River, and he was part of, with William Washington, one of George Washington's cousins. They crossed the Delaware again, and he was one of the forward scouts. Well, when he got over on the other side of the river, they come up to this man's house, and their job is to not let any of the people come into town and warn the Hessians that they were coming in the city of Trenton, New Jersey. So in Trenton, New Jersey, they were, the crossing of the Delaware. They captured one of the greatest victories of the early Revolutionary War. So the dog is barking. They're next to this house. A dog is barking. Man comes out trying to defend his property, saying, "You're not gonna steal any more of my stuff." Well, that guy's a doctor. He realizes from James Monroe's Southern accent that they're Americans. And he says, "Hey, I'm a doctor. Let me grab my bag and I'll help you guys in case anybody needs any help." So he follows them up to where the fighting happens. During the fighting, James Monroe is actually hit in the chest with a bullet, and it cuts one of his arteries. He would have bled to death unless that doctor came with him. Crazy story. Really, really interesting. And then that put him out of commission for a few months. And when he came back, when he was healthy enough to fight again, sorry. When he was healthy enough to fight again, he got a promotion to captain. So he was a lieutenant. He got a promotion to captain. So they said, "Hey, Captain, go back to Virginia and recruit some troops for me. We really need the 3rd Virginia Regiment. We're just really low on troops." Oh, let me show you a picture real quick. If you look, this is the picture of the surrender of the Battle of Trent. I need to give you this one instead. Okay, so here, okay, my cursor's showing up. This is George Washington. He's taking the surrender of this guy. He's the Hessian commander. He actually died, so this picture is not accurate. But this guy is James Monroe, and this is the doctor I was talking about. And then William Washington, who commanded James Monroe's troop, he is right here. He got injured in the hand. So this is one of the Revolutionary War photos actually has James Monroe in it, being cradled because he's almost dying. But I thought that was really, really cool that they had that included. Go back on this one here real quick. All right, so where was I? Oh, so he was promoted to captain, sent to back to Virginia to recruit troops. When he was recruiting troops, he had no luck whatsoever. He recruited 12 men. Is all the men he was able to recruit when he was recruiting troops for the Revolutionary War. So he went back and reported that he wasn't really able to recruit anybody, and he then was sent to join the staff of William Alexander, who was a Lord Stirling. Lord Stirling was an alcoholic, but when you were part of his team, he was one of Washington's generals. He treated you like family. Basically, he adopted you into the family, and it kind of created connections for the rest of his life. At the same time, he also met and became friends with the Marquis de Lafayette, who is one of my favorite people. If you've watched this series so far, every time the Marquis de Lafayette comes in, I'm just always a big fan. He's a big part of Hamilton's life as well. Alexander Hamilton and him were great friends. Move this camera up a little bit so you can see the top of my noggin. Well, not that much of my noggin. That's a little better. And then he spent the whole winter there in Valley Forge in Lord Stirling's retinue or whatever. And then the hardships that the soldiers dealt with there. But then Washington pulled him to the side and said, "I need you. Basically, you're a Virginian. The problem with you being a Virginian is people are going to see me as showing favoritism if I keep you here in close to my staff. I can't have you. I can't have you as part of my staff because I don't want to show favoritism." And because he didn't want to show favoritism, he sent him and he said, "You'll have to go work for somebody else." At that time, what's his name? He volunteered to help train black soldiers in South Carolina, but Congress refused to allow that to happen. The guy's name, he's in the Hamilton biography too. He's one of Hamilton's best friends, but he was an abolitionist from South Carolina, and what he wanted to do is give these black men their freedom and make them soldiers to fight the Revolutionary War. And Monroe volunteered to be his second in command and command a regiment of black troops. But that never happened because he was not able to do that, couldn't find a command anywhere, not under Washington. And because he couldn't do that, he went ahead and resigned from the military. So when he resigned from the military, he needed something to do. He went back to the College of William and Mary to finish his studies. He, after talking to Thomas Jefferson, who kind of became like a mentor to him, Jefferson encouraged him to become a lawyer. He did not want to become a lawyer. He didn't enjoy law. He didn't enjoy the idea of law, but he knew it would get him farther in life and it would help him financially. He needed money. And because he needed money, he became a lawyer. Really, that's the only reason he became a lawyer, is because he needed money. And because he didn't enjoy being a lawyer, he ran for Continental Congress. And he became a Continental Congressman in 1786. No, 85, 1785, I believe. And so he was in Philadelphia and met his wife. Elizabeth Courtright is her name. His mother's name was Elizabeth. His wife's name was Elizabeth, and I believe one of his daughters. I'll have to look on his daughters here. Her name was Eliza, right? Wait, is that? It might have been Elizabeth, and they called her Eliza. I can't remember. But this is his wife, Elizabeth Courtright. Let me share this with you. There we go. Elizabeth Courtright. She was. I can't remember, but he met her in New York City. I didn't write down enough facts about them. He was serving in the Continental Congress at the time. They had 3 children together: Eliza, James, their middle child, who died in infancy, and Mariah. It's spelled like Maria, but back then Mariah was the more common spelling of that. And James died at 16 months old, unfortunately. So back to this. And let's minimize this. All right, cool. Let's see. One large issue for James Monroe during his time as governor and his time as president was slavery. Kind of getting into all of that with the founding fathers. And I'm going to do the I'm going to do the video where I talk about slavery and the founding fathers, the first 5 founding fathers, how they dealt with it, if they were for it, against it, complete abolitionists, really their stance on it. I will do that in the near future. He owned slaves. He at one point, the most slaves he ever owned was 49. And when he had to sell his property, when he sold his slaves because of his money issues, he made sure that the people who bought his slaves would keep families together. Husbands and wives and children, he made sure that they stayed together. He was not going to sell them like one husband goes to over here and then a wife goes over here. He was not going to do that. It was kinder than making them separate, but you know, really, it's a scenario where you look at it and you go, the reason slavery existed at this point was because of money. Really, it was. If he didn't have money troubles, I think he would have freed his slaves. From just the way he talked about it, how he thought it was so morally reprehensible, how he equated them fighting for their freedom because he dealt with some slave revolts, which I'll talk about in a minute. He just really wanted it to end. He couldn't find a good way to end it. And I think he would have freed his slaves if he could have found a way to do it and it benefit him financially. Not saying he's a good man, because he's one of the reasons slavery still exists. I don't think he could have defeated it by himself, but a dedicated group of men could have. And that's something I'll talk about in that video as well. All right. Next page, we're going into his time as a diplomat for George Washington. George Washington, right as his presidency happened, declared neutrality. And his big goal was not to have wars with anyone. He's like, we just got out of a war. I mean, the Revolutionary War was 8 years long. I didn't write down diplomat here, so I'll just put up Continental Congress for this one, because he was in the Continental Congress. That's where he met his wife. But after the Continental Congress, he became a diplomat. They had their one daughter at that point, Eliza, and Eliza went to a French finishing school. Probably a big reason why he became a advocate for women's education. He saw the French finishing school for his daughter, and he, I think, really appreciated the fact that his daughter was well educated, and he sought. I've got a couple quotes here that I'll share with you on how he felt about women's education, which was cool. I mean, he had some redeeming features, but he still wasn't a great man. But out of all of them, I do like. I think president, like so far, the first 5 presidents, I would probably say John Adams, Madison, Monroe, Washington, Jefferson is kind of my ranking of the 5. I think Monroe did well. I think he had some moral standing, and we'll get into that. So as a diplomat, he was mostly there to appease the French because Washington didn't want war with them. But he needed a treaty with Great Britain because Great Britain was doing a thing that they continued to do for many, many years, all the way through most of the presidencies. They were taking U.S. sailors and saying, no, no, you're a British sailor. I can't say sailor for some reason. No, you're a British sailor. They would put them into forced service on British ships to fight the French, because the French were going through the French Revolution. All that was kind of topsy-turvy, kind of happening. Eventually, Napoleon would come into power, um, but not at this time. Napoleon was still just winning battles before he walked in and became emperor. Um, so what they really wanted is they just didn't want France to get mad. France had been an ally through the whole Revolutionary War, fighting against Britain. They provided really the reason the French Revolution happened is because the American Revolution happened, and they were our allies. Um, all their money issues that created the poverty and the starvation that caused the French Revolution all had to do with the American Revolution. Like without the American Revolution, we might still have a king in France, but because of the American Revolution, there's not a king in France. At least that's my opinion. It may have still happened. Who knows? The French do like to revolt. Um, all right. So at that time, John Jay was the minister to Great Britain. He was crafting a treaty, and the French were very upset about it because John Jay would not tell James Monroe anything. He like Washington wouldn't tell him anything. Jay wouldn't tell him anything. The French were going, "Hey, what's this treaty look like? We really don't want you to sign a treaty with Great Britain. You're our ally. You know, we're at war with them. We don't want you to do this." He's like, I have no details. Jefferson's like, "I can't tell you anything. I'm a Secretary of State, but I still can't tell you anything." Um, Washington is only talking with Alexander Hamilton at this point. He's not talking to me. I can't give you any details. And then when everything kind of fell apart, it was all thrown in Monroe's lap. So Monroe basically published every paper that he had, letters between him and George Washington, his thoughts about what was going on at the time. He refused to hear the Dray Treaty because he knew that if he heard about it, he would then be he would in some ways be liable to the French. Basically, he was telling the French, look, I'm going to hear about it when you hear about it. It's going to go back to the United States. I'm keeping hands off on this. I had nothing to do with it. I really didn't want to be part of this. I think this is a bad treaty for the United States, which it was. We really kowtowed to them a lot in the Jay Treaty. And it was widely disliked by the American popular by the people of America. Most people hated it. And so when he came home, he published everything in the newspaper. And because he did that, he really offended George Washington, and it probably ruined their relationship. And before Washington died, Monroe really wanted, I mean, Washington was his role model. He really wanted to rebuild that relationship, but never got an opportunity to do so because of his commitments out of the country. And he was very sad about that. He didn't, he was pretty, it was a big deal to him. So, let's see. I am currently at his governor. When he was the governor, when he came back from being a diplomat in France, he then went in to be the governor. I was kind of talking about it earlier, where at that time, the Virginia legislature had really made it hard to be governor. Let me read you this. I put some markers in here. The governorship of Virginia was an office of great honor but little power. For the framers of the Virginia Constitution of 1776, laboring under an excessive fear of executive authority, had reduced the governor, as Thomas Ritchie commented some 3 decades earlier, to a mere shadow by denying him both the veto and the power to make significant appointments. They were chosen annually by the legislature. The governor was restricted to 3 consecutive terms, so 3 years only. And the financial rewards were the least. There was like no financial rewards. He made $3,000 a year, which he already had money problems, And because he was only making $3,000 a year, he would it made his money problems even worse. So when I talk about the slave revolt, which is the slave revolt of Gabriel's Rebellion, is what it was called. Something that really bothered him. So at the time, Gabriel Palfer was his name, I believe. He was a blacksmith who knew how to read. And because he was a blacksmith that knew how to read, he was considered in part of the artisan class. So Gabriel, sorry, I didn't make a banner for governor, so I'm just going to take this one off. Because Gabriel was considered a artisan, he had the ability to move between plantations, and he wanted freedom. At one point, he got in trouble. Him and two other black men, slaves, were stealing a pig, and the man that owned the pig was a former overseer. They didn't like him. Basically, the guy's like, "Give me my pig back," and he was going to let him go. But Gabriel fought him and bit his ear off, or part of his ear off. And so they were all going to go to prison and be killed. Monroe stepped in and said, "Hey, they deserve a fair trial. They need a fair trial. Make sure they have a fair trial." And while they were receiving a fair trial, there's a clause that if slaves could quote scripture, it was called like the preacher's salvation or something like that, they could commune a death sentence. So he knew his Bible. He knew his Bible well. That was one of the ways that he had learned his language, how to speak and everything. Not how to speak, how to read and write, was by knowing his Bible. And so he got a brand on his thumb saying that he'd already used his biblical salvation or whatever it was. I can't remember exactly what it was. So because of that, Gabriel really started resenting being a slave. I don't think before, I mean, he probably very much resented it before, but after that point, he completely resented being a slave and then actively started the rebellion. He felt the only way to get out from under the only way to get out from under it was a violent slave revolt, which had just happened in Haiti. And so he was taking cues because he was reading the newspaper every time he'd come to town. He'd hear about what was happening in Haiti, which was kind of freaking all the slave owners out. And then he was relaying that news because he was a traveling artisan blacksmith to all the slave plantations in the area. So over time, a couple years, I think, from the time that he stole the pig and bit the guy's ear off to when he actually was working on his revolt, he had garnered hundreds of followers. And then what happened on September 15th, they had recruited two Frenchmen. They had been taking plows and scythes and turning them into swords. Not plows, just scythes. And they were going to be provided with guns. And then they were going to go take what they had, take over the Virginia militia. They had like a storehouse of all their guns and ammunition and all that. And they were going to take over. They were going to take over the governor's mansion. They were going to kidnap James Monroe, murder all the plantation owners, and kind of negotiate their freedom by holding Monroe captive. But two of the slaves rebelled from the rebellion. They gave up on the rebellion, I guess, and went and told on the group. Also, at the same time, one of the worst thunderstorms around happened for like 2 days. So their whole plan was sidetracked, waterlogged, you could say, because of the thunderstorm. So what then happened was James Monroe, knowing about it, got all the arms out of the area, protected the people from the slave revolt, captured everybody but Gabriel. Gabriel was later caught in somewhere. I can't remember where he was caught, and then he was put on trial. But here's the thing. He knew he had to put down the slave revolt, but he wanted to make sure that they had fair treatment, which is interesting. As a lawyer and as a soldier, he personally saw, commemorated, however that word is, he could put himself sort of in the place of the slaves. He understood fighting for his freedom because he was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. He knew picking up a gun and fighting for your freedom. He believed in it, and it bothered him. His son, at 16 months, at the same time, was dying of whooping cough. So he personally equated in. I read the book James Monroe, A Life by Tim McGrath, and it states in there that either he in a journal or in talking to someone else kind of equated himself and Pharaoh, because his firstborn son died during the slave revolt. And it kind of kept him, basically he said, make sure these people are treated fairly, make sure that they have a fair trial. And he actually wrote to Thomas Jefferson and said, I don't want to kill all these people, these men. Like, I know the law is, if a slave revolts, I should hang them and kill them. And he actually was asking Thomas Jefferson, he was like, hey, what do I do here? I don't want to kill all these slaves. I know they revolted. I know that, the law says I should do this. But because he had no power as governor, he couldn't veto. He couldn't push a lot of stuff through. All he could really say is make sure that these slaves get a fair trial, make sure that these slaves are treated fairly and kept in a one of the slaves died, a man named Old Sam, because they didn't keep him in a they kept him in like a cold, damp place, and he died. He got sick and he died. And so I find moments like this where he really shows some character. It's difficult, as I want to see the good in people. I really do. I want to, in moments like this, really make you look at Monroe and go, I think if he had the ability to, and he kind of talks about it later, definitely during his presidency when he's setting up Liberia. His plan was, through the American Colonization Society, was to free the slaves, have the government pay the slave owners for their slaves, and the government would send them on ships back to Africa. Not the best situation, but if it would have ended slavery, I would have been for it. Him and Madison and many others at the time just didn't believe that slaves could live in harmony with white people in America if they weren't enslaved. It was a wrong-headed, it was a bigoted idea. Madison at one time, actually, I talked about it in the last live stream, he saw a freed man running his own farm in Illinois. And a lot of times they would free people from Illinois. They'd send people from Virginia to Illinois to live as freedmen. Kind of, when you hear about freedmen getting captured and then sold to the South as slaves. Sorry, excuse me. Too much soda. That was, they lived free lives in the North, and they were captured and put into slavery in the South, which was awful. To think, be a free man and then captured and sold into slavery when you thought you were free of it. It was awful coming from Africa in the way that they came, but to imagine you'd escaped that life, that pain, and then be captured would suck too. It became illegal, and during his governorship, he actually persecuted two men that had come up with bad money. I can't remember what it was. They embezzled the Georgia government or something like that. They came up to Virginia and they bought a bunch of slaves, most likely captured freedmen, and took them down to Georgia to be slaves on the plantations down there. And on the way back, they actually overpowered the two men, killed them, and were put in trial. That's where Old Sam, he found out that Old Sam was being persecuted. He was actually at that time called a slave lover because he made sure that the slaves were being treated fairly. And the Virginia legislature was like, look, we need to do this. The Gabriel's Rebellion, I wrote it down. Where did I have it? Oh, 77 slaves were captured and 23 were killed, hung. Thankfully, he saved some lives through his actions, but not enough. All right, so at this point, try to think where we are. At this point, he was governor of Virginia. Things were super bipartisan. John Adams was going to come visit Virginia. He told John Adams, he's like, look, people don't really like the Federalists down here. Don't come down. And, you know, they kind of had some bad blood because John Adams had said some stuff about Monroe when he was a diplomat in France. Right after that, Thomas Jefferson gets elected, and his buddy's in power. He believes he's going to get something. He'd always wanted to go to France, so Thomas Jefferson's like, look, I need some help. I've got this big thing that I want to get done. You know, the people in France, the people that are over there are Federalists. They don't like them very much. I need you to go and do the Louisiana Purchase. I'm going to put you in charge of that. Livingston was over there, and he wasn't doing particularly well with the French people. The French people didn't really like him. So he was only supposed to buy, he was given $5 million to buy New Orleans. And when he got there, Napoleon was like, you know, I'm really just ready to sell the whole thing. Partially because of the slave revolt in Haiti, and Haiti becoming a country, declaring their freedom from France. They just could not keep soldiers there in the New World, and said they needed money to finance their war with Great Britain and Russia and the countries in Europe. And so Monroe was sent over there with $5 million to buy New Orleans. When he got there, he's like, dude, this guy's ready to buy everything. So he started negotiating for the entire Louisiana territory, sent some messages back and forth to Thomas Jefferson. He said, hey, I think they're going to let me do this. Monroe, actually, because of his relationship with John Adams, when they were both diplomats in France. Well, John Adams and John Quincy Adams were diplomats to Holland at the time, around that time, different time periods. But John Quincy Adams was a diplomat to Holland. They had a relationship, so he knew some of the people in Holland. John Quincy Adams was also a diplomat to Russia. He spent a lot of time at Russia, and because of that, he had relationships with Dutch bankers. The Dutch bankers said, "We will finance this purchase." If you're willing to pay the interest, we'll finance. Gave $15 million for the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase. So he was instrumental in that. That was a huge part of what he did. And then because he did so well with the Louisiana Purchase, they asked him to go to Spain, try to negotiate for Florida. They wanted Florida really badly. Didn't get Florida, but in the Louisiana Purchase, they were guaranteed West Florida, kind of the Panhandle. And that became a big contention with Spain for many years. That Spain said, no, West Florida's ours. They said, the Americans say, no, we bought West Florida with the Louisiana Purchase. We'll get into that with Monroe's presidency, because we finally get Florida during his presidency. Yeah, it was an interesting time. He then goes to Great Britain. So he goes to Spain, has no luck whatsoever trying to get Florida. Goes to Great Britain, becomes the diplomat there for like 3-4 years. I wrote it down. Where was it? He was the minister to Great Britain from 1803 to 1807. 5 years he was in Great Britain. It was really bad for him and his wife's health. Got to meet the king, got to know the king a little bit. The king was older and a bit mellower. He did have some mental health issues, so it made him a little unstable. And he was the minister to Great Britain all the way until the time that James Madison started running for president. Not became president, but started running for president. So he came home, and Madison had been the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson both terms. And everybody knew that Madison was going to be the next president. Well, the Virginia Republicans were like, no, Monroe is also a guy who's a Virginian and we trust, but he's not James Madison, who they kind of had blamed everything bad from Thomas Jefferson's presidency on James Madison because it was really frowned upon to talk badly about the president at that time, but you could talk about his whole cabinet. So if you had a problem with the president, you just blamed it on one of his cabinet members, and you said, oh, well, I don't like his cabinet member. So James Madison got a lot of the heat for everything that had happened during the Thomas Jefferson presidency. So Monroe, when he came home, everybody was like, hey, we want you to be president. We want you to be president. Madison, he's like, dude, this is my buddy. Like, he's running against me? What the heck? And it kind of hurt the relationship. Well, Monroe was like, look, I'm not doing this. Everybody's putting my name up. I'm not the one that's, trying to get this done. But if I get elected, I'm going to do the job. I'm not going to turn it down just because you're my friend. And it took a little time. They kind of rebuilt their relationship, but it did put a wedge between their, excuse me, I don't know what's going on. It did put a wedge in between their friendship for a little while and kind of made it difficult for them. It got better. It did hurt their friendship, and they became great friends again during his presidency because he was his Secretary of State for the entire time that Madison was in office. Monroe was his Secretary of State. And during that time, they rebuilt that relationship. So Madison's president, 1811. Monroe is Secretary of State. I don't know if you know, back at that time, the Federalists were pretty much losing power everywhere. People were becoming Democratic Republicans, not the Republican Party you know now. And I'll get into that during Monroe's presidency, why they're not the Republicans you know today. The Republicans you know today started, the first Republican president was Abraham Lincoln. That party was founded for the abolition of slavery. That was their ticket. Republicans were the party of the abolition of slavery. The really, really cool when you think about it. The Warhawks were a big part of what happened here. They started petitioning for war. A bunch of young congressmen and senators were basically like, look, Britain is interring our soldiers, putting them in service, capturing them. They had just got over all this issue with the Barbary pirates, where Thomas Jefferson sent the Marines to Tripoli. If you've ever heard, my brother's a Marine. If you ever hear the Marine slogan, they say, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And it's because they actually went to Tripoli and took over their capital for a little while and was like, look, you're going to stop enslaving our people. Stop capturing our ships and enslaving our people. But Britain was doing the same thing. And we needed, he had been working on a treaty to stop the internment of our sailors. It was a huge button of contention with all the presidents, really. The first 5 presidents all dealt with it. Britain was just like, look, we have more naval power than you. We don't care. We will capture your ships. And if they speak English, we're taking them and they're going to work for us. It was a big deal. It really was like a huge sticking point for every president. Every president was like, look, you got to quit capturing our people. You got to quit doing this and forcing them into basically ship slavery. They were getting shanghaied. So we just had enough. And the Warhawks were asking for war. Madison was like, all right, fine. We're going to declare war on Britain and we're going to take Canada. And so that worked out really, really badly. Canada was ready. They beat us back. One of the worst battles. I think we retreated before the battle ever started. It was awful. The Secretary of War at that time was Anderson, I believe. look at this one. Here's the election. Let's see. Madison Administration War of 1812 is where in here? Okay, so the war went very, very badly. The Madison administration sought peace and then was rejected by the British, is what this says here. The Navy didn't do very well. Monroe was actually set up as the Secretary of War in like a short basis, but then they said no. Congress was like, no, you can't have him. And so then John Armstrong, that's who I was looking. That was the name I was looking for. John Armstrong became the Secretary of War. Did very, very poorly. John Armstrong is the whole reason that Washington, D.C. was burnt to the ground. Madison was like, hey, I really think they're going to attack Washington. It makes the most sense. It would cripple us. You need to protect Washington. They're like, no, it's Annapolis, Maryland. That's where they're going to attack. Washington, D.C. is safe. I don't know what you're worried about. Quit stressing about it. I need you to quit even thinking about that. I'm not protecting Washington, D.C. Well, what happens? The British military comes in and they burn Washington, D.C. to the ground. Almost have the president captured. Dolly Madison is like putting the Declaration of Independence in a bureau and putting it on a horse, and they take it out of the city, luckily save, precious papers. It was nuts. And so John Armstrong then resigns because he had done such a horrible, poor job. And that's when Monroe, they're like, finally, okay, let Monroe do the job. He became the first person to ever be the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War at the same time. By all accounts, did a really good job. This is where Andrew Jackson, who's the father of the Democratic Party, he kind of really came into his own. He'd been doing well in the War of 1812 as a commander, but they sent him. He was promoted and then sent to set up the Battle of New Orleans. And the Battle of New Orleans was nuts. He decimated the British right as the treaty was being signed. So the treaty had actually been signed when the Battle of New Orleans happened. I think we killed let me see if I can click on here. Battle of New Orleans lasted 18 days. The British suffered 2,000 casualties, and we suffered 6. No way. Yeah, that's what this says. Let's see. During the battle, 700. Okay. During the battle, 17. Okay, I'm getting conflicting information here. 700 British troops were killed, or wounded. Oh, okay. Sorry. Battle of New Orleans was remarkable for its apparent brevity and its casualties, though some numbers are in dispute and contradict the official statistics. Charles Welsh and Zachary Smith claimed that the British lost 285 killed, 1,265 wounded, and 484 prisoners in 25 minutes. A total loss of 2,084 men. American losses were only 13 killed, 30 wounded, and 19 missing or captured. Around 484 British soldiers had pretended to be dead. They rose up and surrendered to the Americans when the shooting stopped. The standard protocol of the British Army during the 19th century was to only include in the killed column the soldiers who had died during the battle. Soldiers who died of wounds the following day or the following week were not considered killed in the British casualty list. They were counted as wounded only. Okay, so 2,000 to 13. That's a big discrepancy. That's a beatdown. Yeah, had to get my numbers right there. I was all over the place. So 2,084 British soldiers killed to 13 American soldiers. It was a rout. And it really changed the idea of American independence. Basically, we did horribly in Canada and we got our butts whooped. The Capitol was burnt to the ground, but we did well in New Orleans, and that made the American people feel like we actually have a chance. We have a military that can do something, and that was a huge part of why America went in the direction it went, because of the War of 1812. Nothing actually happened. The British didn't take any territory. The Americans didn't take any territory. Nothing much happened, other than a war was fought. Well, something did happen. Native Americans fought for and against the Americans, and some of that soured relations with the South. Really, mostly the South. The North had some trouble too. We didn't do very well with Native Americans. Monroe very much had the policy of, if you learn to farm and you get educated, there's no reason to take you off your land. And he fought for that his entire presidency. Actually almost had Georgia secede on that point. He defended the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation was considered one of the five, what were they called? The five, they had a name. What was their title? It was like the Iroquois, the Mohawks, the Cherokee, the five civilized tribes is what they were called. I'll get into that in a minute. All right, so as Secretary of War, Secretary of State, he did so well. Everybody was like, "Look, this guy's going to get elected." Basically, he was run against when he was when he went to be elected. He was run against by Rufus King, who was the last Federalist candidate. Basically, the Federalist Party died right after this. He was a Democratic Republican, basically the party of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. They were all Democratic Republicans. Even John Quincy Adams was a Democratic Republican because the party had died. Andrew Jackson, we'll get in that in a minute. So when he won handily, he decided, I want to be as bipartisan as possible. He took, who was his vice president? Daniel D. Tompkins. Didn't really do anything. Really, the people that were a big part of what was going on was John C. Calhoun, which was his Secretary of War, William H. Crawford, his Secretary of the Treasury, and John Quincy Adams. Those four men sat in a room, and man, John Quincy Adams was a serial journaler. He talked about all kinds of stuff, and Monroe and John Quincy Adams never became good friends, but they respected one another a lot. Probably the biggest partnership of the era that did so well, other than like the Madison Alexander Hamilton partnership and the Madison Jefferson partnership. They did so much good stuff together. They really, really did. They created a foreign policy together that is still a huge part of the American way, I guess, with the Monroe Doctrine and many other things. So as soon as he got in office, he said, I want to end all this partisanship. I put America back under one party. We're all going to work together. We're all going to be one government. And so his presidency was called the Era of Good Feelings. The Federalist Party died. Everybody became Democratic Republicans. And generally people were happy. He went to the North. He did a goodwill tour through the North. And really everybody was just excited to see him. There was a lot of fanfare. He was a guy that was just really well respected, even though him and John Adams had some problems. He mended that relationship. He wanted to mend the relationship with George Washington, never got a chance. Abigail Adams actually said about him, he was curious, courteous, open, never arrogant and condescending, and generous to a fault. She really appreciated him because he put John Quincy Adams on his staff, and he's the reason that John Quincy Adams probably became a president, because of their relationship together. So she had a respect for James Monroe, and from the John Adams live stream, she was a heck of a woman. She was great, and for her to respect him that much was definitely an important part of their relationship. So he did his goodwill tour through the North, kind of made friends with everybody in the North. Everybody became Democratic Republicans, and we really started seeing some good stuff happen. And then as we got ready for his second term, he ran unopposed. Only president to ever run unopposed in an election. One person voted for, who was it? One electoral delegate voted for somebody else, whoever the vice president was. Maybe Tompkins or Crawford or John Quincy Adams. I can't remember. But they wanted to keep George Washington as the only president who got every electoral vote. And so he was like, I'm going to vote for somebody else, not because somebody else got voted for. He was the only candidate that got voted for because he ran unopposed. But that one vote kept him from being the second president to run and have every electoral delegate vote for him. So he had a lot of trouble with Florida. Let's go into him and Jackson. Jackson's a piece of work. I thought Thomas Jefferson was my least favorite president. From this point right now, I can tell you, I know I'm going to have another president that I hate a whole bunch because there were some bad ones there in the early 1920s. Turn of the century, late 1800s. There were some pretty corrupt presidents. But Andrew Jackson was a horrible man. He was despicable. But he was a heck of a general. So Monroe asked him, the Seminole Indians were coming into the United States into southern Georgia and raiding farms, killing people. The Spanish were supposed to keep them under control and couldn't. So Monroe said, hey, under the treaty with the Louisiana Purchase, we have permission to go and track down these Seminole Indians. And so Jackson was sent to subdue the Seminole Indians, but he way overstepped what he was supposed to do. He took over most of Florida, put it under the control, and said, well, if you can't keep your country, we're going to do it for you. At that time, Monroe had pneumonia. So Jackson sent a letter saying, I'm going to go and do this. That went to his Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun never told Madison about it because he was sick. He was in bed. It was left on a desk in the White House, from what I understand. I may be reading it wrong, but the letter that Jackson said, hey, I'm going to go take Florida. I'm going to go take over Florida. And Monroe's like, I never saw this letter. I never gave you permission to do this. But he knew the power. Jackson was a popular person at the time. Like, everybody liked Jackson, especially in the South. So it was very hard for him to give Jackson a hard time. And he really wanted Florida. So it was one of those things where I didn't talk about the Mississippi River. Mississippi River was a big part of when he was a stuff because of there's so much. I'm looking at the clock here. I'm almost at an hour and 5 minutes, and I'm not even close to telling you everything that happened in Monroe's life. It's worth a read. I would really read up on these presidents. There's so much in here that it's just amazing. These men and the things that they did. Talking about his interactions with the Cherokee Indian tribes, with the Native American tribes, building schools for young girls, his relationship with his kids. there's so much to go on. I'll keep going to an hour and 15 minutes, and then I'll call it. I'll call it. And then we get into the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, hotly contested. Basically, Missouri wanted to be a slave state. Missouri was a territory. They wanted to come into the country. And because of the 3/5 rule, which was the worst thing Madison ever did, because of the 3/5 rule, if Missouri became a slave state, it would throw the balance of power out. There was already this raging debate. Monroe had done all this work setting up Liberia, and they named the capital after him, Monrovia. He had a whole plan submitted to Congress that he was trying to get Congress to ratify, which they never did, where the government would buy the slaves, they'd send them back, they would reimburse the slave owners for their slaves. This whole plan was put in place. Georgia and South Carolina, main proponents that were like, no, we want our slaves. We're not getting rid of them. We'll secede from the Union if you try to take our slaves. Suck it. We hate you. Don't even look at our slaves. So the Missouri Compromise was hotly contested. So the idea was, and it's worth a video on its own, the Missouri Compromise, what happened there. Monroe felt this was a compromise that would hopefully work. The idea was the line, if you look, I'm pointing Missouri right there. Well, the Tennessee Arkansas line that kind of went through Oklahoma as well, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, all these could be slave states. Missouri was the one compromise because it's above that line, the Mason-Dixon line. So they allowed Maine to come in as a state and Missouri to come in at the same time, a slave state and a free state. And basically, Monroe was hoping that with the Missouri Compromise, we would eventually see how awful slavery was, what it was doing to the country, and eventually end the slave trade. He had, in slavery, he had worked his butt off. Galveston down here had an island that they trafficked in slaves, and in Georgia, what was the island in Georgia? I can't remember. So these two islands were the last bastions of slave trading, where they would go to Africa and they would bring slaves over. Monroe ended the slave trade from Africa. He actually captured ships. Any ship that brought slaves over was considered a pirate. Those captains were put in jail. The slaves were freed and taken back to Africa. He really pursued it. He had the military go in and break these islands up, destroy the slave trade on these pirate islands, and basically end overseas slave trading. It was already ending, but he made sure it ended. He was a huge part of that. There was a couple instances where slaves were caught, and he fought to get them freed and sent home. So he hoped that this eventually would bring around the end of slavery. It didn't. It didn't even come close. And that's a different video. We'll talk about that later. So talking more about his presidency, let's come down here so I can remind myself. He was big on internal improvements. I didn't talk about this at the beginning of his presidency. He wanted bridges and roads all through the country. He felt like the infrastructure, especially in the frontier states where we were doing the Louisiana Purchase, all these states had bad roads and bad infrastructure, bad bridges. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to improve roads and bridges in this area of the country. He actually did a tour in his second term of the South and promised that planned infrastructure. That was one of the huge things that he was trying to do. And at that time, when he did that tour, he didn't have any economic power. There was a recession because the South's cotton in the UK, because of the Industrial Revolution, was selling for next to nothing. And people were out of work. Unemployment skyrocketed, but because he had no power to deal with financial issues, that was not his branch of the government, that was Congress. He went down there and he just tried to reassure people. He was like, look, I know times are hard right now. We're going to find a way to do something here. It wasn't until later where presidents actually had the power, like the New Deal with Franklin, FDR, and the New Deal, where he could create jobs. He couldn't do that. He didn't have that power as the president back then. So he went down and he visited all the southern states. I think all of them. He may not have come to Texas. Was not a state yet. I think he made it to Louis. Something happened with Crawford or Calhoun or Clay. One of those, I forgot, but they didn't come and see him. And something happened. He either got sick or somebody got sick. He had to come home. He cut his southern trip short. And a lot started happening with Russia and Alaska right here. Alaska, Russia decided that Alaska was theirs all the way from Alaska down to Oregon. All of the Pacific coast, they were like, this is ours. We claim it. It's ours. We're, so because of that, that's why the Monroe Doctrine became a thing. John Quincy Adams and Monroe were working hard with Spain to try to gain back they were working hard to try to gain Florida. They were negotiating. They were like, look, we're already basically holding Florida for you because you can't control the Seminole Indians. We're being peacekeepers down there right now. The United States military is there. Why don't you just sign the deal with us? Some things happen there. I don't have time to go into. And really, they wanted to fix that. So because of Spain, Simón Bolívar was helping revolts in South America at that time, basically making all of these things happen down in the South. Spain was freaking out. Adams and Monroe got the Spanish to sign the Adams-Onís Treaty. Let me show you this real quick. The Adams-Onís Treaty, basically, they already had West Florida. It would give them Florida in this area right through here, which was also considered West Florida. But they said, leave Texas alone. We don't want you taking Texas. We don't want you to have anything to do with this area. This is ours. But Russia, it's saying that Great Britain claimed this, but around this time, Louisiana Purchase came up into Canada. All this was happening during Monroe's presidency. It came up into Canada, and then Canada came down here. So what we did is we on the 49th parallel, we gave them this area, and then they gave us this area, and basically said, kind of created some strange lines, I know, but created this area for us. So this kind of made the edge of the border with the United States. We kind of gave them the Spanish this area for this area, and we gave the British this area. The Adams-Onís Treaty kind of did a lot of that stuff. It was an influential treaty, but it wasn't exactly that. At that point, then Monroe decided, we've got what we wanted from Spain. I got everything I wanted from Spain. We've got Florida. We've signed the treaties we need to sign. Now we're going to support the South American governments. Nobody else was supporting the South American governments. Peru and Colombia and not Brazil. Brazil was later. Argentina. And they basically just said, we support these people. We're going to trade with them. You're not allowed to come fight them. But we didn't have the power to do it. So that's where the Monroe Doctrine came. The Monroe Doctrine basically states, we're the United States. If you have a colony in the New World, North and South America, the Americas, you can keep it. But you may not, if a colony declares independence, you may not take it back. Any colonies that are already independent, that you cannot come start war with them. You can create no new colonies. And at this time, France, Spain, Russia had all come together with a religious conglomerate, basically. And they were like, we're going to go back and take our colonies back. Sorry, I'm itchy. America said, no, we're not going to allow that. We do not like this idea. There was a lot of back and forth between Madison and John Quincy Adams. They created, sorry, I'm still on the Secretary of State banner. We're in the presidency, 100%. They created the Monroe Doctrine. They wrote it out. They spelled it out to Russia and the coalition, the French and Spanish and Russian coalition. And Britain wasn't making any claims at the time. And basically they said, look, America's us. We support everybody that's down here. We support what's going on here. And Britain said, we'll back it up because we want to trade with these people. We want the materials that to fuel the Industrial Revolution. We want the materials that are in the Americas. And so we will support the United States and the Monroe Doctrine to say, you cannot recolonize, you cannot colonize new territories. Keep your hands off, basically. And then so after that, we finalized a treaty with Russia, basically telling Russia, hey, you need to back off a little bit. The British were supporting us at that time. The French and the Spanish, we were like, look, back off, and it created the foreign policy. And it was used by a lot of presidents. John F. Kennedy used the Monroe Doctrine to kind of the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, with Russia trying to create a colony in Cuba. He used the Monroe Doctrine to back up his claims there. A couple different issues, Spanish-American War. It's been used by a lot of different presidents, basically saying the Monroe Doctrine. We've had this policy for a long time. This policy is not going to change. The British broke on it and created British, what was it? It's Belize now. But it was the last colony till like the 1980s. But Belize, they actually came in and we didn't have the ability to stop them, and they colonized that area. After the Monroe Doctrine, that was one of the few instances that happened, where we couldn't back it up. Unfortunately, we didn't have the military power to do so. So we were relying on Britain. And at the time, Britain wasn't very reliable when we asked them to do stuff. All right, so going back to, let's get back to my notes. So we did the acquisition of Florida. We did the Monroe Doctrine. The election of 1812. Monroe wanted to stay bipartisan. When there's no second party, the party cannibalizes itself. And this is what happened during the election. I know I kind of brought this up and talked about it. The Democratic Republican Party split. The party that John Quincy Adams became was the Whigs. They were a party that didn't do very well. He was the first Whig president, and I believe there was one or two others, but not very many. The Democratic Party, founded with Andrew Jackson. He was at the time, I think he was a senator. He was running for office. The same thing happened with Thomas Jefferson Party. There was no majority. Because there's no majority, Congress got to pick. Sorry, throat strap. Because Congress got to pick, tons of politicking happened. John Quincy Adams had votes. Clay had votes. And Jackson had votes. Clay said, all right, if you put me in your cabinet, or no, was it Crawford? It was one of the two. One of the two men, Crawford or Clay, Calhoun, maybe, I don't know, one of those people decided, all right, I'm going to back off and I'm going to send all my votes to John Quincy Adams. I don't want, in Madison, actually, John Quincy Adams, like I said, he was a serial journaler. John Quincy Adams and Monroe actually had a meeting where they talked about how bad it would be for Jackson to be president. They already knew he was volatile, that he was super popular, and I believe that Monroe wanted John Quincy Adams to be the next president, especially over Andrew Jackson. So when the wheeling and dealing behind the scenes happened, John Quincy Adams became president. Andrew Jackson would not believe that Monroe stayed non-partial. Like, he believed that Monroe supported Adams to be president, and that's why Adams became president. He held a grudge for the rest of his life against that. So, states added to the Union while he was president. We've got Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri. Missouri Compromise, Maine, and Missouri. Right near the end of his presidency, 1821, Missouri got added. I mean, Missouri Compromise sucks. All right, so after his presidency, he still was broke. Part of the reason that we now have a presidential pension is because of broke presidents, and Monroe was really epitomized broke presidents. He didn't make any money while he was in office. His farms didn't do well while he was in office. And then when he got out of office, he had to go back and be a farmer again, but as a president. So everybody wants to visit you. You have to put them up in basically host these extravagant parties, and he couldn't afford it. He really couldn't. So he'd been working on trying to sell his property. He sold his property, and the slaves that were with the property. Tried to keep them together. Said, look, if I'm selling you my slaves, you keep these families together. These people are families. They need to stay together. They've been together on my property their whole lives. They do not get separated. And from what we can tell through some genealogy, or from what the internet can tell through some genealogy, they did stay together. But once that slave owner had died, there was no guarantees. He had one manservant. Let's see if I can find his name. He was his last slave. He went to go live with his daughter, Mariah, in New York. They didn't own slaves. The older daughter, Eliza's husband died. I don't think they ever had any children. So she went back to France and became a nun, converted to Catholicism, and lived the rest of her life in France. She never got along with her sister's husband, so that was a bone of contention. He moved in with them and lived with them for his final years. He didn't have any money. His wife had passed away earlier, and he freed his last slave, his manservant. And from what I can tell, his family after that never owned slaves again. None of his children ever owned another slave. From everything I can find researching on the internet. So his I already told you when he died, but let me go over that again. It was July 4th, 1831. So 3 presidents out of the first 5 died on July 4th. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Monroe. So, legacy, historical reputation. Polls of historians and political scientists tend to rank Monroe as an above-average president. Monroe presided over a period in which the United States began to turn away from European affairs and towards domestic affairs and expansion. His presidency saw the United States settle many of its long-standing boundary issues in Florida, in the north with Great Britain, and he helped resolve sectional tensions through his support of the Missouri Compromise and prevented an early civil war, even though it didn't turn out well. Memorials. I haven't done this in one of these live streams yet, but this is listed here. The capital of Liberia is named Monrovia after Monroe. I think I've mentioned that a couple times, maybe for like 5. In the only national capital other than Washington, D.C., named after a U.S. president, Monroe is the namesake of 17 Monroe counties: Monroe, Maine, Monroe, Michigan, Monroe, Georgia, Monroe, Connecticut, Monroe townships in New Jersey, Fort Monroe are all named for him. Monroe has been depicted on U.S. currency and stamps, including the 1954 United States Postal Service 5-cent Liberty issue postage stamp, the $1 coin that I showed you. And because of the hats that they used to wear, he was called the last cocked hat. That was the type of hat, you know, the tricorn hat. Jack Sparrow's hat. He was the last cocked hat in office. He was also the last president who was not photographed. I didn't know that. All right, so that is the end of this live stream. I went way longer than I intended to. I skimmed over so much. He did a lot. He had a huge life, hugely important life to the United States. Oh my goodness. I recommend this one is good. James Monroe, The Quest for National Identity. There's another one, James Monroe, The Last Founding Father. It has very good reviews. And the one that I read was James Monroe, A Life by Tim Mcgrath. This one is my reference book that I already had, but this is not on Audible. And it's a lot more dry. The Tim Mcgrath version, it definitely had some color in it, which was nice. Made it not boring. I was actually riveted the entire time. Heck of a biography, for sure. Tim Mcgrath did a good job. A lot of people actually say it has too much detail. I didn't feel that way, though. I feel like I got to know him. Maybe it made me a little too sympathetic to him for his acts on slavery. But I mean, he had redeeming qualities in certain different ways. He had redeeming qualities in the fact that he wanted slavery to end. He actively petitioned for it. He had plans to end it. He fought the slave trade and ended the slave trade, ended the slave trade in piracy, ended the slave trade in every way he could. Publicly said he wanted slavery to end. I don't think by himself he could have done it. I don't think he could have ended slavery if he wanted to. They'd have kicked him out of office, or Georgia, South Carolina would have seceded from the Union. Another cool thing that he did, we kind of talked about the Cherokee tribes. He refused to kick them off their land. One of the big things made Georgia super mad at him. Basically, they said, look, we want the land that the Cherokee Indians are on. It's ours. We should have it. There's no reason why the Cherokee Indians should be here. They're not Americans. They're natives. We need them to move west. Get them out of here. He's like, no. These people, we promised them this land in a treaty. We promised them this land, and they keep it. There's no reason to remove them off their land. He did in letters tell them it would be easier for them to move, but he refused to sign any bills or petitions that say we're going to move them off their land. Commendable. I might do a thing on presidents, because Grant was bad too. Grant's my favorite president, and he even felt, he's like, look, if you guys just become more American, we'll stop having all these fights. Because he was dealing with like frontier, like the Sioux Indians and the Crow Indians and stuff. That was right after the Civil War. There was a lot of hostility as we started to move west. And really, he said the same thing that Monroe said. It was the doctrine of all you have to do is become more Americanized, and you'll stop. These clashes will stop happening. Stop, hunting and gathering, that kind of thing. And you look from our perspective, you look at it and you go, that's just not their culture. That's not who they are. There's no way you can tell them everything you stand for, every bit of your culture, just do away with it. But these men were trying to find middle ground. They were saying, we want you, we don't want to hurt you, we don't want to kill you, we don't want to kill your people, we don't want to destroy your families, but these people are coming. Westward expansion is happening. We can't stop it. There's no way we can stop it. The president doesn't have the power to stop it. And they probably didn't want to stop it, honestly, to be all and 100% honest with you. They probably didn't want to stop the westward expansion that was so difficult on the Native American tribes. So they tried to make the best out of a bad situation. Thankfully, he didn't forcibly move these people off their land. I'm so glad that he didn't. But I'll end it there. We're way past. I'm at an hour and a half. So much I didn't talk about. So much I didn't get to. It's worth a read. I really would. When I started this, I didn't know if Madison or Monroe was 4th and 5th. I knew they were 4 and 5, but I didn't know which was which, who came first. This has been so enlightening, so eye-opening. Next book I'm going to read. Let me get my Audible. I've already downloaded it. John Quincy Adams. Let me get you the author of the biography that I'm going to read. I will also post this in the Discord. Now my phone wants to take forever to load. It is John Quincy Adams by James Traub. Oh, it's making me want to try to do some. Okay. But yeah, James Quincy Adams by Traub is going to be the next one that I personally read. I don't have a physical copy of it yet. I'm going to order one off Thrift Books or somewhere. But see you guys. It's late. I'll talk to you later. Bye.